All right, guys, what a weekend it was for college basketball. Man, these first and second round games are just amazing. I love this past weekend. It's my favorite sports weekend of the year. Hate to see it gone, but it was so exciting. And hey, we got the Sweet 16 coming up and Elite 8 this weekend. So it's just it's been a great tournament. Want to talk about the things that we learned from this first and second round. And I'm recording this right now at halftime of Alabama, Texas Tech, UConn, and UCLA is on my other TV here. We got two TVs set up. We pretty much done this all weekend. Um, but man, it was a great weekend of basketball again. I just want to talk about again things that we learned from this first and second round. The first thing we got to point out is the Cinderella runs and the major upsets. I think are gonna be few and far between now. This is pretty much the second year in a row where there hasn't been any like major big time upsets. And I know some would say, no, High Point over Wisconsin was a huge upset. And yes, that was a big upset, but I think some people were picking that, and High Point's a really good team. They won over 30 games this year, only lost like 5 or 6 games all season. So like people were picking that upset. What I'm talking about is like in previous tournaments, it seems like every year there was at least one upset that nobody saw coming. And there was at least like one team that made a really deep run that nobody pictured happening. Like Loyola Chicago a couple years ago made it to the Final Four. NC State a couple years ago as an 11 seed made it to the Final Four. And I think about big upsets like, Princeton beating Arizona a few years ago, FDU beating Purdue that year, and UMBC beating Virginia. Nobody would have thought those things, would happen. And this is the second year in a row where like pretty much there was no upset over a 12-5. Like, I mean, like there was no upsets from a 13 seed, 14, 15, or 16 seed in the last two tournaments. And, it's kind of sad to see that because that's kind of what makes March Madness like magical and fun, of these upsets. It's still fun and amazing, but it doesn't have, it hasn't had those upsets, those crazy upsets like we've seen in previous years. And maybe that's due to NIL and the transfer portal. I think that's definitely part of it. But I will say this, although the Cinderella runs and upsets, maybe, few and far between, I don't think it's over completely. Like, I definitely think that there's going to be years where like a 13 or 14 seed wins, or maybe even a 15 seed still, or a 16 seed. I think that's still going to happen at some point. I just think it's not going to happen as much. And I don't think that there's going to be a, like a 12 or 13 or 14 seed making it like to the Sweet 16 or Elite 8 or Final Four much at all anymore. I think it can happen, but it's going to be few and far between. That's my, prediction just based on what these last two tournaments have shown us, and that, again, I think it's, the major contributor to ending this is the NIL and transfer portal. But I do think it could happen and it will happen in future years, just not as much. And I know that kind of hurts a little bit to see that, but it's just the changing landscape of college basketball. I wish it was different, but this is where we're at right now. The second thing I wanted to point out is that seeding makes a big difference. Seeding makes a big difference. I know sometimes like teams get in the tournament, you're like, oh, okay, whatever. They're a 5 seed or a 4 seed, whatever. And you don't really think like that's that big of a deal. And especially like for a 16 seed or something like that, you're like, oh, that's not big of a deal. Well, it really can make or break your team in the tournament. Like, let me give you a couple examples, like Siena. All right, Siena was never going to win the championship. That was never going to happen. But like to win a game for them, that's a big deal for a team like Siena to win a game in the NCAA tournament. They're matched up with Duke in the first round as a 16 seed. They did not believe that they were a 16 seed. I don't know what they thought they were, maybe like a 15 or 14, but I don't think they were a 16 seed either. But they were seeded as a 16 seed, had to play one of the best teams in the country, if not the best team in the country, and they hung with them the entire time. And that's why I'm saying, like, I still think some of these upsets can happen because we have seen so many teams get so close. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But, like Siena hung with Duke. And, like, if they were a 15 seed playing a 2 seed, who knows? Maybe they would have gotten over the hump and won. Or if they were a 14 seed, playing a three, they could have maybe won a game, and that's a big deal for a team like Siena. The other team I think about here is Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt got absolutely wrecked by the NCAA tournament committee selecting them as a five seed. I just didn't really get that. I think if I'm remembering correctly, I watched a video from Evan Miyakawa, and Evan Mia has his own, analytics site, kind of like Ken Palm and Bart Torvik, but he said something like, Vandy was closer to like a three or even a two, and I don't see it, them getting to a two seed, but like I think three or four was probably where they should have been. They were slated a five seed, and I think they were an incredibly dangerous team, and they showed that even in a loss to Nebraska. I think they showed that. But here's the issue. Had they not been a five seed, they would have never ran into Nebraska in that game. Nebraska was a four seed. Would have never ran into Nebraska and ran into this team that Nebraska is a really good team this year, could absolutely stroke it and just, happen to get the best of Vanderbilt there in the end. And like, had they been seeded properly, that may have not happened. They may have, made it a little bit further. And I think they were a dangerous team. They just, again, happened to run into a really good Nebraska team. So being seeded, incorrectly, that kind of hurt Vanderbilt. If they were a four or three, I wonder if they'd still be in this tournament. And I think they could have made a big run. I know some people would say, well, you gotta at some point you're gonna play these teams anyways. You gotta win these games. But I would say this: listen, if you're slated properly and you have a good matchup, like you could win those games and advance further in the tournament. So who's to say Vanderbilt wouldn't have gotten a better matchup? I know eventually you've got to play a good team, but maybe they would have matched up well with that good team. Anyways, seeding does make a difference, and it can kind of make or break you in the tournament. Another thing I learned is, man, the SEC has been on fire in this tournament. Yes, several teams did lose in the second round. Like Kentucky lost, and not a good loss. Florida lost. I'm okay with that actually. I actually picked Iowa, but they're 11-4, I think, so far in this tournament, and that's a really good record. You got several teams in the three teams right now, and it's looking like if Alabama can hold on to this 25-point lead, it's looking like you're going to get four teams in the Sweet 16. So I mean, you're getting a fourth of the teams in the Sweet 16. It seems like the Big Ten has also done pretty good here. They've got Michigan State. Unfortunately, for them, Iowa and Nebraska play, so one of them is going to have to be knocked out. Illinois is in, and Michigan's in. So Big Ten has done really good too. And I think, these were two really good conferences all season long. So they're kind of showing out here and doing really, really well. I mean, it looks like UConn's also taking it to UCLA. I picked UCLA, and that's not going to happen. But they were close here, and then UConn's gone on a run. But SEC and Big Ten have played really, really well, and some of these teams are going to match up. In the Sweet 16. Texas Tech. No, it looks like. I'm sorry, I said I didn't count Purdue. Purdue's also in the Sweet 16 here. So you got for the Big Ten, you got Michigan State and Purdue as in the top of the bracket, and the bottom of the bracket you got Iowa and Nebraska. That's four. Illinois and Michigan. Wow, that's insane. Six teams in the Sweet 16. I mean, the Big Ten is really killing it right now, and a really good shot for them to end their championship drought. They haven't won a championship since like the early 2000s. I want to say 2002 with Michigan State. Man, they could really end it here, this drought here. I mean, they've got so many teams in. I hope they don't, to be honest, because we're SEC fans. But it's six teams is so impressive in the Sweet 16. So, and hats off to the Big Ten and SEC's right behind them here, looking like they're going to get four in. But man, Big Ten is killing it right now. And I was highlighting SEC, but Big Ten's doing even better. So I would also say I think this tournament is like the tournament of oh so close is how I'll word it. Like so many teams, I feel like we're just so close. We were talking about the upsets and the Cinderellas being over, but there were so many teams that were just right there and just could not, close it out. I think just looking down at like the first round, Siena, right there, where Duke had a 13-point lead and only lost by 6 to the number one team in the country. They were just right there almost, pulled off that upset. South Florida crawled back against Louisville, lost by 4. That was a little bit more of a, handling by Louisville. They kind of had to lead the whole game. Still a close game. Furman was right there with UConn until the very end. Just could not close it out against UConn. Furman was very close there as well. McNeese fought hard with Vanderbilt. Although Vanderbilt won by 10 and kind of took control in the second half, it was still a close game throughout that first half and into the second half. Um, Santa Clara's not a huge upset over Kentucky if it would have happened, but like they were right there. And if Otega Owe didn't hit that insane shot, they would have won the game. Wright State was right there with Virginia too. Like only lost by 9, but they were winning most of that second half, I feel like, and just could not get over the hump, and Kennesaw State fought hard with Gonzaga in that first round. I mean, it was just so many games that were so close. And then you even go to the second round, like High Point almost had Arkansas. I mean, they were just so close. I mean, even Miami fought hard with Purdue. There were just a lot of games that were so close. And this is why I'm saying, like, eventually, in future tournaments, there's going to be a team that kind of gets over the hump and pulls off the major upset. So I think, again, it may be few and far between now, but it's going to happen at some point. So it's just been that kind of tournament where these higher seeded teams have just kind of closed it out and maybe just had more in the end, more gas in the tank in the end, more talent in the end to just overcome these lower seeded teams, lower level teams. But it's been awesome nonetheless. And man, some of these Sweet 16 matchups are really awesome. Arizona Arkansas is such an intriguing matchup. Looking forward to seeing how they handle Darius Acuff, how Arizona handles Darius Acuff there. Tennessee, Iowa State, kind of similar, styles there. But man, I think my favorite one that I'm looking forward to is Illinois and Houston. That is a huge, huge matchup. Number 2 versus number 3. And of course, Duke St. John's going to be an awesome one. But we'll talk about Sweet 16s in another video. Hope you had a good weekend watching college basketball. Take care and God bless.